The bookstore smelled of dust and aged paper, the kind of scent that wrapped itself around you like a forgotten memory. I had wandered in on a whim that afternoon, drawn by the creaky sign swaying above the door. Second chances, rare finds, and antique reads. Inside, the space was dim, lit by a single overhead bulb and a scattering of mismatched lamps that cast long, flickering shadows across the rows of overstuffed shelves. "Take your time," the elderly shopkeeper had said with a raspy voice, retreating to a desk at the back. His gnarled hands returned to the task of sorting a teetering stack of books, their spines faded beyond recognition. I wove through the aisles, the air thick with a mustiness that seemed to weigh down the room. My fingers brushed over cracked leather and fraying fabric covers, each title more obscure than the last. I had no particular purpose, just the simple, calming ritual of looking. But then I found it. The notebook was tucked away on a crooked shelf in a corner that felt colder than the rest of the store. Its plain, unmarked leather cover gleamed faintly under the weak light. The edges were scuffed, the kind of wear that suggested long, reluctant use. Something about it called to me, like a whisper just out of earshot. I picked it up and flipped through its pages. They were yellowed and rough, faintly brittle to the touch. Most were blank, though faint indentations hinted at past writings that had been erased, or perhaps never completed. The weight of it felt unusual for something so small, as if it carried more than just paper. "How much for this one?" I asked, approaching the counter. The shopkeeper paused, his milky eyes narrowing as he inspected the notebook. "Ah, that one. A curious thing, isn't it?" He hesitated, then shrugged. $15. I paid quickly, the exchange tinged with a vague sense of unease I couldn't explain. As I left the shop, the bell above the door jingled, but the sound felt flat, swallowed by the heavy air outside. The notebook rested under my arm, its cold leather pressing against my ribs. That night in my small, cluttered apartment, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook again. The dim light of the overhead fixture cast soft halos across its pages. As I ran my hand over the first page, I noticed faint scratches along the leather binding, patterns that looked accidental at first glance, but became disturbingly deliberate the longer I studied them. I dismissed the thought, shaking off the chill that had crept up my spine. It was just an old notebook, I told myself, and whatever stories it held had long since faded. But as I turned the pages, the room seemed to grow colder. The first message appeared 3 days after I brought the notebook home. I'd left it on my desk, unopened since that first night. Something about it had made me hesitant. Maybe the way its blank pages felt less inviting and more watchful. But that morning, as I sipped my coffee, I noticed it sitting slightly ajar, its pages curling upward like a beckoning hand. I leaned closer. The faint smell of old paper wafted up as I opened the cover. And there it was, a single line scrawled in the top corner of the first page, written in ink so dark it almost gleamed. "Remember me." The words sent a chill skittering down my spine. My heart stumbled as I traced the faint, uneven strokes. I hadn't written them. No one else had been in my apartment. My first instinct was that the shopkeeper had left it there, but the thought crumbled under scrutiny. This was fresh ink, not something that had been sitting on the page for decades. For hours I stared at the notebook, searching for an explanation that would make sense. Perhaps I had written it absent-mindedly, some remnant of a dream slipping into reality. Or maybe I had simply missed it when I first flipped through. But as the day wore on, doubt festered. And then, that night, the second message appeared. It was a single word, scrawled in the bottom corner of the second page, its letters smaller and more jagged than the first. "Listen." I slammed the notebook shut, heart pounding. It felt alive in my hands, the leather oddly warm, almost pulsing. I set it down on the kitchen counter and backed away as if it might lunge at me. The room felt heavy, like the air had thickened. "Just a prank," I muttered aloud, though the sound of my own voice did nothing to soothe me. My gaze lingered on the notebook, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was lingering back. I didn't touch it again for days, but the sense of its presence never left. The following morning, as I walked past the desk where I had stashed it, I caught a faint scent, earthy, like damp soil. By the fourth night, the notebook called to me again, this time in a dream. I saw it resting on the desk, its pages fluttering even though there was no breeze. And then I heard it, a voice, low and echoing, whispering something I couldn't understand. When I woke, my breath was shallow, my skin damp with cold sweat. I stumbled to the desk and snatched up the notebook, flipping through its pages in a frenzy. Near the middle, a new message had been written, stark and undeniable. "Please, before it's too late." The words struck like a thunderclap. My hands trembled as I dropped the notebook, watching it fall open to a blank page. The apartment seemed to shudder around me, the faint hum of my refrigerator morphing into a hollow drone that rattled in my chest. I was no longer alone in my own home. The notebook had brought something with it. For days, the notebook sat untouched on my kitchen table, its leather cover gleaming faintly under the dull light. I avoided it like a bad memory, but it was always there, pulling at my attention. The messages etched into its pages haunted me, their desperate tone gnawing at the edge of my thoughts. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was waiting. Finally, on the seventh night, I gave in. With trembling hands, I picked it up, the leather colder than I remembered. The air in the apartment seemed to grow heavier as I opened the notebook to its middle pages. At first they were blank, the faint indentations from past writings, the only sign of life. But as I stared, the blank space shimmered, like heat rising off pavement. And then, letters began to form. "You found me." The words appeared slowly, as if etched by an unseen hand. I gasped, my body rigid with fear, but I couldn't look away. Another line followed. "Don't leave me again." My breath hitched. The notebook wasn't just a conduit for messages. It was alive, desperate to communicate. Summoning courage I didn't feel, I whispered, "Who are you?" The ink darkened, bleeding into new shapes. "I was forgotten. Buried. Please listen." The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and my breath formed faint clouds in the air. The voice from my dream returned, faint and distorted, like a record played at the wrong speed. This time I could make out words. "I'm lost. Alone. Help me." The sound was soft but pierced me like a shard of ice. It wasn't coming from the notebook. It was everywhere, reverberating in my bones. "What do you want from me?" I stammered, clutching the edges of the notebook until my knuckles turned white. The ink shifted, forming a single chilling word. "You." I slammed the notebook shut, my pulse roaring in my ears. I wanted to throw it away, burn it, anything to sever the connection. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't work. This was no ordinary object. It was bound to me now, an unseen tether tightening with every interaction. That night the dreams returned. This time I saw a shadowy figure standing in a dim, featureless space. Its edges blurred, as if it were made of smoke or fog. It extended a hand, and I felt a cold, invisible grip around my wrist. "Please, find the truth," the voice said. When I woke, I couldn't shake the sensation of icy fingers lingering on my skin. The next day, I turned to research, desperate for answers. I combed through online forums about cursed objects and supernatural phenomena, but nothing matched what I was experiencing. Then I stumbled upon a photograph buried in the archives of a local history website. The image showed a small, dusty bookstore, the same one where I'd bought the notebook. The caption read, "Former site of the Jasper Mortimer Library, demolished in 1927 following a series of mysterious fires." In the background, barely visible, was a figure holding a notebook that looked eerily familiar. I clicked deeper into the article. Jasper Mortimer was a reclusive scholar who had vanished under suspicious circumstances. His disappearance coincided with the first in a string of unexplained fires, and whispers of occult practices surrounded his name. The library's ruins were said to be cursed, with locals avoiding the site for decades. The photograph burned in my mind as I stared at the notebook on my table. Was this his? Was that voice in the dreams his? The questions circled endlessly, but one truth became clear. I had to keep going. The notebook wasn't just a possession, it was a puzzle, and solving it might be my only way out. By the time I reopened the notebook, the air in my apartment had taken on a suffocating weight. The usual hum of the refrigerator and creaks of the floorboards were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the faint rustling of unseen movement. The notebook seemed to pulse faintly in my hands, as if alive. "I want answers," I whispered, my voice trembling but firm. The ink moved immediately, as if it had been waiting for me. "You must release me." "How?" My voice cracked. "What does that even mean?" The ink shifted, forming intricate diagrams and cryptic symbols that felt ancient, as if they belonged to a language long forgotten. And then, a sentence appeared, sharper and darker than before. "Find the binding." The word carried a weight that seemed to ripple through the room. Binding. I racked my brain, recalling fragments from the articles I had read. Was the notebook a vessel, its leather cover not merely a binding but a prison? And if so, what held it closed? The symbols on the page began to glow faintly, their intricate lines searing into my vision. A low hum filled the air, accompanied by a faint whispering that grew louder with each passing second. My skin prickled, as if the very fabric of the room was being peeled back. I flipped through the pages, desperate for clarity, and found a sketch, a crude but unmistakable image of the notebook itself, surrounded by jagged shapes. Beneath it, a single phrase. "The circle must be broken." The meaning was unclear, but the urgency was undeniable. I grabbed a notebook from my desk and began to copy the symbols, hoping they might form a clue. As I worked, the whispers intensified, overlapping until they were almost deafening. Then, silence. I turned to the notebook. Its pages now glowed faintly, casting ghostly light across the walls. And on the last page, a final message appeared. "Tonight, midnight. Be ready." I closed the notebook, my pulse racing. Whatever was coming, it wouldn't wait. I had until midnight to decipher the truth. The clock on the wall ticked louder than I'd ever noticed, each second dragging me closer to midnight. The apartment had transformed into a place I barely recognized. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching unnaturally across the walls, and the air shimmered faintly, as though it carried a static charge. The notebook lay open on the kitchen table, its pages blank but exuding a presence I couldn't ignore. Midnight was minutes away. I stared at the symbols I had copied earlier, the jagged lines and strange loops now etched into my memory. The phrase kept echoing in my mind. "The circle must be broken." I didn't know what it meant, but instinct told me I had to prepare. I cleared a space on the floor, tracing the symbols with trembling hands. Using chalk, I recreated the strange, intricate designs, connecting them into a rough circle. The act felt both absurd and urgent, as though unseen eyes were watching, judging each stroke. The temperature in the room plummeted as I worked. Frost crawled along the edges of the windows, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The notebook began to hum faintly, vibrating against the table. Its glow intensified, casting flickering light that danced like fire. When the final stroke of chalk was complete, the hum stopped. Silence descended, so thick it pressed against my eardrums. The clock struck 12. A low, resonant sound rippled through the room, a deep vibration that seemed to emanate from the notebook itself. The pages flipped violently, stopping at the center where new writing appeared, scrawled in hurried, jagged strokes. "Break the seal. Release me." The words seemed to pulse, drawing my gaze deeper into the page. My fingers hovered over the notebook, trembling as cold tendrils of air coiled around my wrist. "What happens if I do?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The air thickened, carrying a single, mournful whisper. "Freedom." The glow from the notebook brightened, illuminating the chalk circle on the floor. As the symbols began to shimmer, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint ring etched into the leather cover of the notebook, so subtle it was nearly invisible. It was the circle, the one that needed breaking. I traced the ring with my finger, the leather warm beneath my touch. The apartment seemed to hold its breath as I pressed down. The glow flared, filling the room with blinding light. Shadows danced wildly across the walls, twisting and stretching into impossible shapes. And then, the light dimmed. In the notebook's place stood a figure, faint and translucent, its form barely holding together like smoke caught in a draft. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated a profound sadness, as though it carried centuries of sorrow. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer with words. Instead, images flooded my mind, snapshots of another life, another time. A man hunched over a desk, the notebook open before him. His face was worn, his hands trembling as he wrote furiously. I felt his desperation, his regret. And then, fire. Smoke filled the air as flames consumed everything, leaving behind only the notebook, unscathed. "You were trapped," I whispered, understanding dawning. "Bound to the notebook." The figure nodded, its outline flickering. The glow from the chalk circle intensified, drawing my attention. The symbols shimmered, their shapes shifting and rearranging themselves as though alive. "What happens now?" I asked. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the center of the circle. The symbols pulsed with light, their hum growing louder, resonating in my chest. I realized the circle wasn't just a prison, it was a gateway. "I have to finish it," I said, the words coming unbidden. The figure nodded again, its form growing fainter. Summoning every ounce of courage, I reached toward the circle and pressed my palm against the largest symbol. The chalk felt cold and brittle under my skin, and the room erupted in light. The hum crescendoed, filling the apartment with sound and light until I thought I might collapse under its weight. Then, silence. The light faded, leaving the room bathed in an eerie stillness. The notebook was gone. In its place lay a single feather, its edges faintly glowing. The air felt lighter and the oppressive cold had lifted. The figure was gone, its presence no longer lingering in the corners of the room. But the silence was not empty. It carried a sense of peace, as though a weight had been lifted from both of us. I sat on the floor, staring at the feather, the echoes of the night replaying in my mind. The nightmare was over. But as I rose to my feet, a faint whisper brushed against my ear, so soft it could have been imagined. "Thank you." The words carried a promise and a warning, and as I stood in the quiet of my apartment, I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly ended the story, or had I simply written a new chapter in shadows?